It was another regular day at the theater, the kind where everything seemed to fall into place. The stage was set, the lights had been checked, and the actors were getting ready for their rehearsal. Everyone was preparing for the big show that was just days away. The director, feeling the weight of the pressure, walked through the backstage area, thinking about all the details he needed to manage. This production was important. It was a show everyone was counting on. The opening night of Echoes of the Heart was fast approaching, and the audience would be expecting nothing less than perfection. The director had worked on this play for months, carefully selecting every actor, every musician, and every detail of the set design. It had to be flawless. But there was one problem: the lead pianist had fallen ill. Just days before the opening performance, the pianist who was supposed to play the music for the entire show was unable to perform. It wasn't something you could fix easily. Finding a replacement at the last minute, especially one who could deliver at the same level, seemed almost impossible. The director, now frustrated and stressed, sat down at his desk and looked through the list of understudies. His mind was racing, trying to figure out who could step in without ruining everything. That's when he saw the name Jake Matthews. Jake wasn't a well-known musician. He had been an understudy, someone who had filled in when other musicians were unavailable. But Jake had never actually performed in front of a live audience. He was an unknown, someone who had been quietly waiting for a big break, and the director wasn't sure if this was the right time. Still, there was no choice. The show had to go on, and Jake was the only option left. So the director sent a quick message and asked Jake to come in for a rehearsal. It was a last-minute call, and the pressure was on. The director had no idea what to expect, but deep down, he hoped that Jake would be able to rise to the challenge. A few hours later, Jake arrived at the theater. He looked nervous but determined. He had heard the stories about how difficult the director could be. The director was known for his high standards, his perfectionism. He wanted everything to be perfect, and he didn't tolerate mistakes. Jake was used to playing smaller gigs, nothing too fancy, just local performances. But this was different. This was the big stage, the kind of opportunity most musicians only dreamed of. As Jake walked into the rehearsal hall, he felt the weight of the moment. There were a few other musicians in the room, tuning their instruments, adjusting their sheet music. The director stood in the corner, watching him carefully. Jake felt all eyes on him as he walked to the grand piano in the center of the room. The room seemed to hold its breath as he sat down. For a moment, everything was still. Jake placed his hands on the keys, feeling the cool, smooth surface beneath his fingers. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the nerves that were threatening to take over. He didn't want to mess this up. He didn't want to disappoint anyone. But there was something else, something he couldn't explain. It was a feeling inside him, something that told him to just trust the music. He closed his eyes for a second, and as his fingers touched the keys, something strange happened. The nervousness faded away. It was like he had stepped into another world. The music was all he could focus on now. Each note felt like it belonged in that exact moment. The sound was rich and full, filling the room with an energy that no one had expected. The other musicians, who had been quietly warming up, paused as they listened. It was unlike anything they had heard before. It wasn't just that Jake was playing the notes correctly. He was playing with something more. There was an emotional depth to his performance that caught everyone off guard. It wasn't the kind of music that you could easily replicate. It felt raw and real, as though every chord was a story unfolding. The director, standing at the back of the room, couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had expected an average performance at best. After all, Jake was just an understudy, someone who had been waiting in the shadows. But this? This was something completely different. The music seemed to flow naturally from Jake. His hands moved across the keys with a kind of fluidity that was both effortless and powerful. The way he played, with such passion and intensity, made it seem like he had been performing for years on this stage. His eyes were closed, lost in the music, completely unaware of the people around him. It was as if the piano and he were one. Every note he played seemed to carry a deep emotion, and in that moment it felt like the room was transported to another world. The director, though trying to remain calm, was in shock. He had seen plenty of musicians over the years, many talented ones, but never one like this. It wasn't just technical skill. It was something far more powerful. There was something in the way Jake played that connected with the very soul of the music. It was as if Jake wasn't just playing the piano. He was telling a story, speaking a language that transcended words. The rest of the musicians, who had been skeptical at first, were now completely captivated. They had expected another awkward rehearsal, another day of trying to work with an unprepared replacement. But what they were hearing now was far beyond what they could have imagined. Jake wasn't just filling in for someone else. He was bringing something new to the table, something that was fresh, unexpected, and exciting. The music seemed to hang in the air, filling every corner of the room. Even the director couldn't pull his eyes away from Jake. It was as if the moment had taken on a life of its own. Time seemed to slow down, and for a brief moment it felt like the entire world was watching this one person. When Jake finished, the room was completely still. No one moved, no one spoke. It was as if the music had taken over everything, and the world was holding its breath. Then slowly the director broke the silence. He clapped once, slowly at first, then louder, his hands echoing through the quiet room. That was incredible, the director said, his voice barely above a whisper. He couldn't hide the awe in his tone. I didn't expect that. You've got something special. Jake, still sitting at the piano, opened his eyes, unsure of how to respond. He hadn't expected such a reaction. I don't really know what to say, he stammered. I just played what I felt. The director walked toward him, still processing what had just happened. What you just did, it's not something you can teach. That kind of raw emotion, that connection to the music, it's something most people never find. Jake didn't know how to respond to that. He had always just played the music that came to him. He never thought too much about it. But sitting there now with the director looking at him with such intensity, he realized something. This wasn't just a regular rehearsal. It was the start of something big, something that could change everything. And the director, still in awe, knew that this young pianist had just given him more than he had ever expected. He had given him hope. Hope for the show. Hope for the future. The director could hardly focus for the rest of the rehearsal. His mind was still replaying the music that Jake had just played. It was hard to believe that the shy, nervous young man sitting at the piano had created such a powerful performance. He had expected the usual, a simple fill-in for the lead pianist, maybe a few awkward moments, but nothing that would stand out. Instead, Jake had done the opposite. He had completely stunned everyone in the room. As the other musicians began to resume their parts, the director found himself lost in thought. The performance had been unlike anything he had heard before. It wasn't just about the technical skill. Sure, Jake had played all the notes correctly, but it was the way he had played them. Each note filled with emotion, each chord speaking directly to the heart. That made the difference. The director knew that what he had just witnessed wasn't something that could be learned from books or taught in a classroom. This was a rare gift. He walked slowly over to Jake, who was still sitting at the piano, looking unsure of himself. The nervousness had returned to his face. He had barely looked up during the performance. His eyes focused entirely on the keys, as though in a trance. Now he seemed almost shy again, unsure of what had just happened. Maybe he didn't even fully realize the impact of his playing, but the director did. Jake, the director said, his voice calm but firm, that was incredible. I'm not sure if you understand just how special that was. Jake looked up, meeting the director's gaze for the first time since he started playing. You really think so? He asked, his voice quiet. I mean, I was just playing, the director smiled. It wasn't just playing. You made the music come alive. That's not something most people can do. Jake blinked, clearly taken aback by the praise. He had never been the type to seek attention, and he certainly wasn't used to this level of praise. I don't know about all that, he said, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. When I sit down at the piano, I let the music come out. It's like the notes are already there and I'm just the one who gets to play them. The director nodded thoughtfully. He could see that Jake wasn't trying to be humble. He truly didn't seem to understand the significance of what he had just done. To Jake, playing the piano was simply a way to express himself. But to everyone else in the room, it was more than that. It was a revelation. Listen, the director said, his tone more serious now. I've worked with hundreds of musicians, but I've never seen anything like this. What you just did? That was not just a good performance. That was something rare. And I think you could do something incredible with this. I want you to take over the role of the lead pianist for the show. Jake's eyes widened in surprise. He hadn't expected this at all. Wait, what? He asked, clearly not sure if he had heard correctly. You want me to play for the whole show? The director nodded. Yes, the opening night is just a few days away. The lead pianist is out, and you're the only one I can trust to step in and make this work. You've got the talent, Jake. I've seen it. The audience deserves to hear what you just played. Jake opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He hadn't prepared for this. He had only come here as a backup, never expecting to actually perform on stage. And now the director was asking him to take over a major role in the production. It was a huge responsibility, one that seemed almost impossible. The nerves that had faded earlier came rushing back. I don't know, Jake said, his voice low. I mean, I've never performed in front of an audience before. This is a big deal. What if I mess up? The director took a step closer, his expression serious but encouraging. You won't mess up. I can see it in you. You've got the ability to connect with the music, to make it something more than just notes on a page. That's what we need. The rest of the musicians will follow your lead, and the audience will feel it. Trust me, Jake, you've got this. Jake hesitated, his hands still resting lightly on the piano keys. The weight of the decision was heavy on his shoulders. He wasn't sure if he was ready for this kind of pressure, but something inside him stirred. He had always dreamed of performing on a big stage, but he had never imagined it happening this way, without notice, without preparation. Yet deep down he knew the opportunity was too rare to pass up. He looked up at the director, who was waiting for him to respond. There was no more time to second-guess himself. The decision needed to be made now. I'll do it, Jake finally said, his voice more confident than he felt. I'll play. The director's face broke into a smile. Good, I knew you'd say that. He clapped Jake on the back. You're going to be great. Just stay focused, trust the music, and let everything else fade away. We'll make it work. Jake nodded, though doubt still lingered in the back of his mind. He had agreed to do it, but now the reality of what he had just promised began to sink in. Performing for a live audience wasn't the same as playing in a small rehearsal room. The pressure would be immense, but there was also excitement, an undeniable sense of possibility. This was his chance, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. As the rehearsal came to an end, the director made sure everything was set for the next few days. He told Jake to go home and rest, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling of nervous excitement. He left the theater, his mind racing with thoughts of what was to come. Could he really pull this off? Could he deliver a performance that would match the director's expectations? He had never played in front of so many people before, and the thought of being the center of attention was a little terrifying. But at the same time, there was something in him that wanted to prove it, to prove that he could do this, that he could stand on that stage and deliver something beautiful. As he walked home that evening, Jake thought about his journey. He had spent years practicing, working hard, and waiting for an opportunity like this. Now that it was here, he wasn't about to let fear hold him back. He had to believe in himself, in the music, and in the people around him. If he did that, maybe, just maybe, he could do something truly special. The days leading up to the performance felt like a blur for Jake. The pressure was mounting, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking a tightrope. The director's confidence in him was both reassuring and terrifying. He had never imagined being thrust into such a big role, especially with so little time to prepare. But now it was happening. There was no turning back. Every night Jake practiced late into the evening, running through the music over and over. The piece was beautiful, but it was also demanding. He had played it countless times in rehearsal, but now that he was stepping in as the lead, it felt different. The weight of the music seemed heavier, more important. Each note carried more significance than ever before. But despite all the practicing, there were moments when doubt crept in. What if he froze on stage? What if the nerves took over and he couldn't perform? The thought of sitting at that grand piano under the bright stage lights with the entire audience watching him made his stomach twist. It was a terrifying thought, still he kept practicing. He didn't have a choice. He had agreed to do this, and backing out now wasn't an option. The director had believed in him, and he had to trust that belief even when it was hard to believe in himself. The night before the performance, Jake couldn't sleep. His mind raced, thinking about every detail. What if he made a mistake? What if the audience could tell he was nervous? He had heard stories about performers who had blanked out in the middle of a show, or worse, completely lost their place. It was a nightmare scenario, but at the same time, there was a part of him that couldn't help but feel a spark of excitement. This was his moment, his chance to prove that he belonged on that stage. By the time the morning of the performance arrived, Jake was exhausted. He hadn't slept much, but there was no turning back now. He arrived at the theater early, walking into the grand lobby with a nervous energy that seemed to buzz in the air around him. The theater was still quiet, and he was the first one there. The crew was setting up and the musicians were warming up. It felt surreal, like he was walking through a dream. He made his way to the piano and sat down, running his fingers lightly over the keys, trying to calm his nerves. The soft sound of the piano seemed to help a little, grounding him, bringing him back to the music. This was what he knew, what he had always loved. Maybe, just maybe, he could focus on the music and let everything else fade away. The director arrived shortly after, walking into the room with a focused look on his face. He was calm, but there was a noticeable energy in his movements. He was always intense before a performance, but today there was something else. An excitement, a kind of anticipation that Jake hadn't seen before. It made him wonder if maybe the director was as nervous as he was. "Jake," the director said, walking up to him with a nod. "How are you feeling?" Jake looked up, trying to hide his nerves behind a forced smile. "I'm ready," he said, though his voice trembled just a little. "I think. I've been practicing, but—" The director raised a hand, cutting him off gently. "Listen, I know this isn't easy, but I've seen what you're capable of. You've got something rare, something that most people don't have. Don't overthink it. Trust yourself and trust the music. That's all you need." Jake nodded, though doubt still lingered in his chest. "I'll try my best," he said quietly. The director gave him a reassuring smile. "That's all I'm asking. You're going to be great." As the hours passed, the other musicians trickled in. The room slowly filled with familiar faces, the quiet hum of instruments being tuned, voices practicing lines. The air was thick with nervous energy. Jake sat at the piano, eyes fixed on the keys, as though they could somehow provide him with the answers. He had played the piece so many times before, but today everything felt different. The music had never seemed so important. Soon the stage crew began moving into position, and the director called for the first full rehearsal. Jake's heart began to race. This was it, the final test before the real show. The curtain was pulled back and the lights came up, casting a warm glow over the stage. The musicians took their places and Jake could feel the weight of it all. The audience was out there waiting. Not today, but soon. It was just a rehearsal, but it felt real. The director gave the signal and the music began. Jake's fingers moved automatically, the notes coming out almost on their own. But there was no escaping the reality of the situation. Every note felt heavy, every chord more complicated than the last. His palms were sweating, his hands trembling just slightly. He tried to ignore the nerves, focusing only on the music, but as the piece went on, something shifted. As he played, he began to feel the connection between himself and the music once again. The earlier nerves slowly melted away. He stopped thinking so much about the technical aspects and allowed the music to guide him. His fingers no longer felt stiff. Instead, they moved fluidly, almost instinctively, as though the piano was a part of him. He was no longer just playing the notes, he was telling a story, sharing a piece of his soul with the audience, even if there was no one in the seats yet. The music swelled, filling the room with its beauty. Jake closed his eyes, letting the sound of the piano wash over him. For a moment, it felt like he was in his own world where nothing else mattered. The only thing that existed was the music, and for the first time that day, Jake felt at peace. When the final note rang out and the last chord settled into silence, Jake opened his eyes. The room was still, but he could feel the tension in the air. He had done it. He had gotten through the first rehearsal without freezing up or losing his place. It wasn't perfect. There were a few moments where his fingers faltered slightly, but it was enough. It was more than enough. The director, standing backstage, gave him a nod of approval. Jake could see the pride in his eyes. The other musicians, too, seemed impressed. Jake hadn't been sure what to expect, but now, seeing their reactions, he felt a sense of relief wash over him. Maybe, just maybe, he could do this after all. The rehearsal ended shortly after, and the director pulled Jake aside. "You were great," he said with a grin. "It's not perfect yet, but you're on the right track. Just keep that focus and you'll be ready for the real show." Jake felt a surge of confidence, and for the first time since agreeing to take on the role, he believed it. Maybe this wasn't such a crazy idea after all. He still had a long way to go before the performance, but the rehearsal had shown him something important. He could do this. And in that moment, for the first time, he felt ready. The night of the performance arrived faster than Jake had expected. It seemed like just yesterday when he was nervously sitting at the piano for the first rehearsal, unsure if he could handle the pressure. Now, here he was, standing backstage dressed in his costume, his hands slightly trembling as he tried to focus on the task ahead. The theater was buzzing with energy. The cast was warming up, the crew was making final adjustments, and the air backstage felt electric with anticipation. Jake could hear the audience trickling into their seats, the murmurs of excitement filling the space. His heart was racing. Tonight he was going to play in front of a packed house, people who had come specifically to see the show. This was it, the moment he had been preparing for. He stood in the shadows of the backstage area, away from the hustle and bustle of the other performers. The grand piano was positioned center stage, bathed in soft light. He could already picture himself sitting at it, his fingers moving across the keys, feeling the weight of every note. For the past few days he had been practicing nonstop, refining every detail of his performance. But now it didn't feel like the same piano he had practiced on in the quiet rehearsal hall. Now it felt enormous, intimidating. Jake took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He closed his eyes for a moment and thought back to the advice the director had given him just hours before. Trust the music. Don't overthink it. Let it come to you. Jake nodded to himself. He had been living with this music for so long, playing it every day, thinking about it even when he wasn't at the piano. He knew the notes by heart now, each one embedded in his mind. It wasn't the music that scared him anymore. It was the performance. The idea of being watched, of feeling the eyes of the audience on him, judging his every move. But deep down, he knew this was his moment. He couldn't let fear take over. He had to believe in himself. The stage manager appeared from behind the curtains, giving him a quick thumbs up. "You're up, Jake. Ready?" she asked, her voice calm but with a hint of excitement. Jake gave a tight smile. "I guess so," he said, his voice a little shakier than he would have liked. "Don't worry," she said with a wink. "You've got this." With that, the stage manager disappeared back into the shadows, and Jake took one last breath before walking toward the stage. He felt his nerves building again, but this time they were different. It wasn't fear, but more like the kind of anticipation you feel before something amazing happens. As he stepped into the spotlight, the audience fell silent. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He could feel the eyes of every single person in the room on him. The theater was packed, the seats stretching out in front of him like an ocean of faces. He could hear the faint sound of people shifting in their seats, the rustle of programs being flipped open. Jake's gaze locked onto the grand piano at the center of the stage. The world around him seemed to blur. All that mattered now was the music. He sat down slowly, positioning his hands over the keys. The familiar weight of the piano felt grounding, like it was anchoring him to the present moment. As the first few notes of the introduction echoed through the theater, Jake felt a wave of calm wash over him. He had been here before. He had played this music so many times, and now it was just him and the piano. The orchestra began to play softly behind him, and Jake's hands followed the familiar rhythm. The tension in his body began to fade. He focused on the music, letting it take him where it wanted to go. Each note felt natural, as if the piano was speaking through him, telling a story only he could tell. The first few minutes went by without incident. Jake's confidence grew with each passing second. The nerves that had been gripping him backstage were beginning to melt away. As he played, he let himself be carried by the music, and he started to forget about the audience, about the pressure of the performance. All that mattered now was the music. But then, in the middle of a delicate passage, something unexpected happened. A note, just one note, didn't sound right. It was too sharp, too out of place. Jake's fingers faltered for a split second. His heart skipped and his stomach dropped. He was immediately aware of the mistake, and for a moment panic set in. No, no, no. His mind raced. "I can't stop now. Don't mess this up." But instead of freezing, Jake did something he hadn't expected. He kept playing. He didn't try to fix it or cover it up. He simply let the next note flow naturally, continuing the melody as though the mistake had never happened. The music didn't stop. It couldn't stop. The next few seconds felt like hours. Jake's fingers continued to move across the keys, but his mind was racing. What had just happened? Had the audience noticed? Was the mistake too obvious? Then he heard it. The soft, subtle sound of the orchestra behind him, picking up the rhythm and guiding him forward. The other musicians didn't falter. They continued as if they hadn't noticed a thing. And then, just like that, Jake was back on track. He breathed again, letting the music carry him away. By the time the piece reached its final movement, Jake was no longer thinking about the mistake. He had let go of the fear, the pressure, the worry. It was just him and the music flowing together in perfect harmony. The final notes echoed through the theater, ringing out like a promise, a beautiful conclusion to a journey that only he had taken. When the last chord faded into silence, Jake opened his eyes. The theater was still, and for a moment it felt like the world was holding its breath. Then slowly the audience began to clap. Softly at first, then louder as the applause grew, filling the entire theater. Jake sat there, stunned, his hand still resting lightly on the keys. He couldn't believe it. He had done it. He had made it through the performance. The director, standing in the back of the theater, was clapping with a huge smile on his face. The look in his eyes told Jake everything. You did it. You really did it. Jake stood up slowly, bowing to the audience, a smile creeping across his face. The applause grew louder. For the first time, he felt a rush of pride, not in the perfect performance, because it wasn't perfect, but in the fact that he had trusted himself enough to keep going. He had made it through, and that was enough. As he left the stage, he could hear the whispers of the audience, the admiration in their voices. He couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment wash over him. It wasn't just about the applause. It was about the journey he had taken, about the fear he had overcome, and the music he had shared with the world.